Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Critical Analysis. Thank you for joining me once again as we tackle one of my favorite genres in game design, horror. But before I begin, I would like to talk to you guys about the channel. The reception of my first video was awesome. It is nothing substantial, but the comments you have posted, as well as the analytics, are extremely useful to me, and I am paying very close attention to them. With the analytics I have seen from my last video, I have made the decision to lower the max video time from about 15 minutes to about 10 minutes. So from now on, all my videos will be in between 10 to 15 minutes, closer to the 10-minute mark. I believe that this will work better with the analytics in mind. As always, let me know what you think below, and whether or not this changes for the better. I have been a horror fan since my early years in gaming, long before the industry haphazardly became what it was today. Long before Steam rose to the waves of glory and PlayStation and Xbox got in bed together, there was Silent Hill 2. It was my first experience in the horror genre, but it would not be my last. From Extermination all the way up to Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, I have often partaken in the delicacy of horror games. And while some are better than others, the vast majority of games for a while were very disappointing in nature. It was almost as if the industry hit a lull in game design within the horror sector. Or perhaps we simply got tired of the lack of innovation and overuse of horror tropes. Regardless, within the last 5 years, a massive exodus in the horror sector has occurred. With indie companies picking up the mantle, the innovations of the horror genre continue to grow to this very day. Games like Alien Isolation, creating new, unpredictable environments through the use of clever coding. Games like Five Nights at Freddy's, creating a terrifying experience that's meant to be shared and viewed by others. And of course, games like Dead by Daylight, carving out their own genre by introducing the unpredictability and problem-solving nature of other players behind the wheel. Something an AI will not be able to achieve for a very long time, it's safe to say. However, while this idea is not inherently bad on paper, unfortunately in practice it does not work out quite as intended. While I have not been around forever to see the beginning of this design, I believe the origins of this particular multiplayer design branched out from what was originally a source mod. I may be wrong in this, but it's the only proof that I really have. Although they share almost nothing in common now, every time I play one of these games, I'm reminded of my time spent playing the hidden source mod. And as far as I'm aware, this was the first meaningful incarnation of gameplay, pitting singular evil characters up against a group of survivors, or in this case, a group of operatives on the hunt. This would not be an easy feat, however, as the Hidden, the one chosen player among 6, was completely invisible to the naked eye while standing still, and while moving, he could outrun operatives 4 times over. The Hidden could even run on walls and ceilings, making the entire fare completely unpredictable. And truly, it was a terrifying experience, as operatives slowly got picked off one by one. The game kind of felt like a mashup of like what you would consider like the Predator video game feeling like, and something that felt kind of like an SCP in a way. Since then, games like Evolve, Dead by Daylight, and Friday the 13th have all made different takes on this basic design, putting players behind the wheel of their own murder fest and subsequent survival. And now, it's last year's turn to take a whack at it, bringing to the table with it the classic slasher-style horror movie style that I know and love, mixing with an almost chess-like style of gameplay behind it. So needless to say, I was actually very excited about this game before it launched. However, my very first encounter with this game led me to a very grim reality right away. Right at the beginning, you realize very quickly that in these types of games, that a player is not a good substitute for a well-coded AI. At the end of the day, players never play the way you want them to, or play the way the game was intended. A well-made AI in a horror game is not there to only kill you for your mistakes, but also to create tension by not killing you. Tension is such a massive factor in horror that the absence of it basically zaps any suspense out of the game you're playing. And the reality is, players don't play to create tension. They don't play to scare you. They don't play to toy with the survivors. They play to win. And because of this, unfortunately, last year is a bore fest from the very beginning. It's a horror game that forgets to be scary. And really, it's not alone in this factor. I didn't find Dead by Daylight or Friday the 13th to be really very scary at all. Unfortunately, it kind of seems that these games have missed the one thing that made the Hidden so terrifying in the first place. There was no escape in the hidden. It was just the killer or you, right down to the last man. Presenting the survivors with such an intense ultimatum that was not linear was the lifeblood of the hidden. And it was what made the game truly terrifying, as you lost man by man, one by one. And it's what made victory over the killer so gratifying in the end. These escape-based games, I find victory in these games to be so monotonous, so bland, that you may as well not play survivors at all. Simply put, last year is just not scary. Like Dead by Daylight, or even less so, last year's attempt at horror is almost pitiful. Almost exactly like a very bad B-horror movie. You know those scenes that would be scary, but you would see the wires and the monsters in the camera? Unfortunately, the designs behind last year often allow you to see the inner frameworks of how the game works, and in some cases, abuse them quite significantly. And that's a major issue I have with the game. It's not necessarily the game's design that ruins the game, but how the community chooses to use those designs. And while people will simply shrug it off as the game being bad, I have a very different take on this. It is absolutely 100% possible for a player meta to destroy and ruin a game. And while the developers of said game may not do anything about it for fear of losing the players who use those, it serves to drive other players away. Last year, although it may not realize it, has a very bad problem with this. From players metagaming and trapping an entire further room because the maps are so linear, to stranglers grabbing people and throwing them into traps. The entire game is riddled with designs that almost every player uses. And as it turns out, it makes for gameplay that makes you sigh in annoyance more than anything else. But the worst issue of them all, really, at least to me, is the added system of a free disappearance after killing a player. This system, which the devs have obviously implemented in an attempt to balance gameplay, has simply neutered the entire game of any real methodical gameplay. And for all intents and purposes, that was how the game was originally designed. It was not supposed to be a killer versus survivors game. It was supposed to be a game of chess, with the killer separating players out and taking them down one by one, like a real slasher movie. Now the killer just boils down to whack the nearest player and disappear, repeat. There's very often zero repercussions for the killer appearing in front of an entire group. And even if the players are winning a fight against him, the killer only needs to start an animation on one player to secure both a kill and a way out of any situation. And people do this a lot, as you can imagine. Why the hell would anybody think methodically when it's so much easier to just use hit and run tactics like that? On paper, this system is intended to give the player a better chance at killing the players. But in practice, it just makes the entire game overly repetitive and annoying to play. This design also serves to kind of destroy any tension buildup that you might be able to have as a survivor, really. At the beginning of the game, the tension is there, as you don't know when or what character the killer would pick. But unfortunately, after almost every first encounter, the entire game falls apart, especially when the meta gameplay is performed right out of the front gate. The biggest issue with this is that every so often you will come across someone who does not play to win, someone who plays to toy with his survivor, someone who plays for fun, without all the meta abuse. And the game is actually very fun and interesting, further adding to my annoyance and frustration with the game's design, because just beyond the veil of stupid bullshit, you can see there's a finely crafted game there that kinda just requires you to play with people you know to actually experience. Unfortunately, every single map plays almost exactly the same way. Despite having different objectives and different map styles, it all boils down to go here, pick this up, crank this thing, refill this thing, run to the exit. And while this is fine, it makes maps extremely linear, and honestly, it's not very replayable at all. This, combined with the fact that most of the killers play exactly as you would expect them to by the meta, means that the vast majority of gameplay is predictable and boring. And in all honesty, that goes against the very basic designs of the game we have already set in place. The whole point of replacing the AI in horror games with a player is to add unpredictability to the gameplay. But if everyone plays exactly the same way, popping out at exactly the same times, and running the exact same metas, he's actually behaving worse than you could code an AI to run. While this would be okay if the gameplay was any less linear than it is, because of the way it's set up, it makes it blatantly obvious that everyone plays very similar to each other, and that there's just no fun to be had in the entire game, outside of like maybe 15 hours of gameplay. At the end of the day, unfortunately, no matter how much I enjoy this game's initial design, no matter how much hype I had for this game, I just can't bring myself to enjoy it with random players. And because the studio decided it was a good idea to have an initial launch on the currently shut down Discord store instead of a real opening and launch on Steam, basically no one knows about this game at all. So finding a game with random players is few and far between in the first place. Compounding on that, because of the game's current state, I just can't bring myself to recommend this game to any of my friends to play with me. Perhaps if they fixed the linear design, perhaps if you fixed the metagaming and focused on the immersion of the moment rather than the breakneck speed linear gameplay of Whack-A-Survivor, perhaps then the game could be something interesting. Perhaps if you change the entire core gameplay into a face-to-face game of hide-and-seek, with survivors desperately looking for scraps to pull together to have a chance to kill the killer instead of a cliche, lame-ass escape scenario, the game would actually be fun and interesting. Perhaps if you attempted to reward the killer for toying with the survivors instead of killing them. Perhaps if you even attempted to use any of the basic horror elements that all writers and game makers use to create a terrifying experience, you could have something. But it's not that. Unfortunately, the whole game comes off as a cliche-riddled snorefest with one-tone characters, over-the-top cliche killers that hardly manages to even get a cheap jump scare, as well as something like Ao Oni, a fucking Flash game, for fuck's sake. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm angry about this, because I am. I wanted this game to be good. And horror is one of the genres that I hold dear, as I'm trying to be a horror writer myself. So seeing a game waste such potential like this in the horror sector really just sends me over the deep end. And then there's the fucking lore. My god, the fucking lore. So I wasn't going to talk about this because it just wouldn't make it into the video, and it doesn't really matter all that much. But I cannot do it. I can't. So I recently found out that the name of the Nightmare update is not meant as a nomenclature for the situation the game has you in as a survivor. It is literally meant to be a dreamscape by lore. So basically, instead of writing any good lore at all, the devs thought it was okay to simply write everything off as a dream. In turn, literally writing everything that happens in the entire fucking game off. And it is well established that this is no longer okay in the horror genre. It is the most cliche of horror writing. And it's literally on the first page of what not to do in horror. So guys, as always, remember to like, subscribe if you haven't, hit that bell icon. Thank you guys. It's your support that keeps me doing this, and the last video had a great reception, so I hope to see a lot of you around a lot more, talking in the comments and, you know, things such as that. Thank you guys for coming out. Thanks for watching till the end if you made it to the end. I need a drink.